Order. I'm going to call the Honourable Annette King.
And thank you for that, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, at the beginning of this whole process, Labor set out 5 bottom lines before we would support the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And one of those bottom lines was that Pharmac must be protected. And Pharmac is a model which, as members know, is set up for the negotiation, the purchase and the subsidisation of medicines for New Zealanders. And it's been supported by this Parliament since its establishment in June 1993. And over time there have been some minor changes to Pharmac. It actually started off as a joint venture company owned by 4 RHAs, but by 2001 it became a Crown entity. There have been changes in things like reference pricing, multi-product tendering, changes to the advisory committees, PTAC and the Community Advisory Committee. There have been changes to operating procedures, and quite recently Pharmac got the right to buy medical devices. There's even been the rare political government interference in Pharmac. So, you know, who could forget John Key saying in 2009 that, quote, stepping in to fund a 12-month course of Herceptin was his proudest achievement during National's 100 days. So I would say in the main we have had a cross-party support for this agency. So we were keen to watch and wait to see what the secret negotiations under the TPP would do for Pharmac. And I have to say, we got the first indication when a number of Labor MPs were briefed by the then Trade Minister, Tim Grocer. He briefed Andrew Little, Phil Goff, myself, Grant Robertson and David Shearer. And I questioned him about Pharmac. At that point, he became very obtuse. He was very slow to understand the questions. No, it might not. I can be very sure, Minister. He was, first of all, very obtuse, very slow to understand our concerns. And when we pressed him about the negotiations in relation to the patents on data exclusivity as they affect biologic drugs, he became very collusive. Very collusive indeed. And finally, he became constructive. He called the TPP approach to Pharmac and the patent period for biologic drugs constructive ambiguity. Constructive ambiguity. Those are the words of the former Trade Minister. And this was what he said about the patents. What we've put in place, I'm sorry, no, it wasn't. Now, wait a moment, now can I address that issue? Because the Minister is waving at me and saying it was a confidential briefing. And we asked at that briefing, and if those members of my colleagues who were there would like to back me up, can we quote you on this? What did he say? And you weren't there, Minister. You weren't there. Oh, no, you weren't there, so don't make it up. He said, yes, you can. Constructive ambiguity. So these are the words the Trade Minister said about Pharmac. And because ambiguity is exactly what we have got. Number one, the TPP will not change the Pharmac model, thundered Todd McLean. But the agreement does change the model, Minister. And of course, when Mr Mitchell was speaking, I asked him questions because there he said there'll be administrative changes, increasing transparency for the big pharma companies. How, Minister? How will that administrative change work? Have we been told how the administration changes, giving more transparency or work? No, not one word on it. The second one, we're told that there'll be a setting of a time frame for considering funding applications. How long? What sort of time frame? How will that work? No, we have not been told that. The third one is there will be a review or appeal process when Pharmac declines an application. How will that work? Who will make that decision? How will the review work? What sort of appeal will it be? Where will the appeal go? None of that has been provided. We still have ambiguity going on around this issue. We were then told the best guess of the cost was $4.5 million in establishment costs and $2.2 million a year in operating costs. But you see, I don't believe it, because I believe what Treasury provided when they released their papers. And this is what they said. The impact of the agreement on the cost of pharmaceuticals is uncertain. I'm quoting directly from the Treasury paper for the members opposite. The cost on pharmaceuticals is uncertain and will only materialise over time. It makes it difficult for the current government to make credible commitments to funding, Minister. That's what Treasury said. And in particular, the costs associated with transparency provisions, brackets, if they eventuate, close brackets, will be unpredictable and lumpy. The estimate provided, average annual costs over the long term, is essentially a quantifiable risk rather than a precise costing that can be funded. That is what Treasury said, Mr. Speaker. And so when we get the flannel from the members opposite, not one of them have answered the questions that I have put to them and that Treasury raised around transparency and a way it would work. So, Mr. Speaker, then we got the grand statement from the Minister that it was going to have a minimal impact on New Zealand. This is where Mr. Gross's constructive ambiguity was mentioned. The term of the patent currently on biologic drugs for the data exclusivity is 5 years. But what was negotiated was deliberately ambiguous. Ambiguous. It was ambiguous. It was ambiguous. The whole thing is ambiguous. Biologic drug. And I have to say, it was deliberately done to have ambiguity. That's it. That's what he said. And they might. And while Mr. Robertson's here, the Minister has been disputing that we were allowed to use the words constructive ambiguity. He said we weren't allowed to use that because the previous Minister wouldn't let us. That is totally untrue. He said that we may. Well, we get back to the biologic drugs, Mr. Speaker. These drugs are produced from a variety of natural sources, from human, animal or microorganisms, and they are cutting-edge technologies. They are expensive. So New Zealand need to be able to have access to these drugs as soon as possible. And if the patent on the data exclusivity of these drugs is not 5 years, but some other number that is tied up in ambiguity, like 8 or 12, thousands of sick New Zealanders will have to wait a long time to get life-threatening medicines. And so then I looked at the Cabinet paper, and Minister, you may have read it because we couldn't read most of it. Can I just show the Minister why most of us couldn't read it? This is the Treasury paper on the biologic. It is full of what you call redacted. And as I would say, it's blankety blank, blankety blank blank, and blankety blank blank. That is what we got from this government opposite around the biologic drugs. And so then we had the real oil come out when the trade negotiator from the US, Michael Froman, said the administration is developing ideas how to resolve complaints by congressional Republicans that the TPP required market exclusivity period for biologic drugs that is too short. So they send down some trade envoys to give us a tutorial on what we ought to be doing in New Zealand. They are saying that they do not want 5 years. They want 12, but there is somewhere in the middle that could be around 8 years. And so what we have got in this constructive ambiguity is for New Zealand to say, well, look, it's going to be 5 years, but along with other measures that deliver a comparable outcome. What does that mean? 5 years plus other measures to deliver a comparable outcome. Comparable to 12 years or comparable to 8 years? It's 5 years plus. So it's not just 5 years. So this is where the dishonesty has been about Pharmac. And that is why, yes I can, the dishonesty about farming and how it is going to work. And Mr Speaker, I am going to oppose it
Order.
so long as they
The
cannot
member's
answer
time
these questions.
has expired.
Mr Speaker.
I'm calling